clear over the last few days, the last couple of weeks, that those Odinga supporters wouldn't go and vote. I mean, one of the questions is, could there be more violence? But it really does seem, from what we have seen and heard over the last few days, that people just want to move on with their lives. They've had enough of this electioneering, politicking. It's leaving them financially stuck. Businesses aren't developing. They're concerned about division in the community, tension. Many people have even packed up and gone back to their villages because they didn't want to be here in Nairobi or in Kibera, in any of the hotspots during the vote. So it looks as though it could be business as usual at the end of this election if it's successfully carried out. The only potential spanner in the works would be if the Supreme Court once again stepped in and said that there were voting irregularities. But as we know, we saw on Wednesday a real reluctance from the Supreme Court to get involved. Their judges didn't turn up and they didn't make any ruling about whether to delay this election further. It seems that across Kenya, except in the case of the opposition, people want the vote to go ahead.
For more on this, I'm joined by Chris Suckling. He's an African risk analyst and is based in London. Thanks so much for joining us, Mr. Suckling. Now, how invested is the world in what happens in Kenya today?
I mean, it obviously has importance across sub-Saharan Africa. As your correspondent referred to there, the Supreme Court's decision in August to nullify that presidential election was actually the first time a Supreme Court has done so in the history of the continent. So really, in terms of electoral reform and principles of democracy going forward, certainly the eyes of the world are on Kenya in that sense.
And what would you say is Raila Odinga's endgame here? He's called for a boycott. Then he's also said that he wants to transfer his party, to transform it actually, into a resistance movement after the election. What is his plan?
I mean, key to think about here is that Raila Odinga has unofficially boycotted, so he didn't actually submit the boycott papers that are necessary to the Election Commission, and that's obviously shown by the fact that he's still on the ballot paper this time around. I mean, from his point of view and from many of his supporters, really, I think the key issue here is that we've obviously seen in the previous 2013 elections that there were obvious concerns over poor electoral reforms there. So this looks like a leader who's trying to extract as many concessions on electoral reform as possible and use Kenya as a case study for the rest of the continent. But I think the real question going forward now is, what does the opposition do afterwards? And actually, given that Odinga himself is likely to retire from politics probably in the next few years, at least in a formal capacity as the party's leader, is where does new leadership come from? And then where does that leave Kenyan politics going forward? And will it be based on, for example, regional and ethnic coalitions, or will we actually see more of an informed choice based around policies across these ethnic divisions?
And what do you think will happen, and what would be the effect of having more political limbo in Kenya?
I think actually quite the opposite. I mean, none of this affects the legislative and county elections, so the legislative elections remain unaffected, so we're unlikely to see any kind of paralysis actually through the National Assembly, because the boycott there seems to be somewhat ineffective. And also what really counts here, I think, is actually the county level elections in Kenya's 47 counties. That's where for many citizens there's actually most to gain, and actually that reflects more or less the distribution of power and the organisation of the ethnic voting blocks in the country. But I think a real concern going forward will be actually, as your correspondent mentioned, is whether the Supreme Court actually will convene and address some of these very complex constitutional issues going forward. And I think one thing that really needs to happen actually is that there needs to be some kind of flexibility within the Constitution and electoral law to address some of these issues, because that's what we're seeing now. Things like a very restrictive 60-day time frame in order to hold a rerun, it makes it very difficult to process some of these issues in a way that takes on board the views of both sides in this election.